everybody, it's McGann, and I am here today to present what I think is the truest Coraline timeline. Now let me do a side note here and say that if something doesn't occur in the film or book, it's not a true fact. And sometimes the film and the book will still contradict each other anyways. Now there are things that may be very likely or plausible, but a theory is only an observation unless a creator comes forward and says that the idea is accurate. So just because a detail is on Wikipedia or in another theory, that doesn't always make it correct, and it doesn't mean that I have to agree with it. And while I do thank the theorizer for sending me on my own Coraline theory journey, I have mostly formed my own unique independent ideas and theories over the last few months. Overall, I politely disagree with the theorizer on 3 main points. First, based on my calculations, the dates on the candy jars represent the dates that the residents of the Pink Palace first moved into their apartments, and I just don't think that they are dates that relate to all of the ghost children. Second, I've stated over and over throughout my theories that I firmly believe that Coraline remains permanently trapped in the other world and that she never goes back to the real world. Third, after looking at all the clues that I can find, by my best estimate, I think the Black Cat works with the beldam as her familiar. Although I do really enjoy the theorizer's reincarnation theory for the cat, I've come to believe that the cat would more than likely be Wybie's father that was transformed into a cat, and that the cat is not there to help the children, but to help keep children trapped in the other world. So you are welcome to believe whichever thing that you think feels right. But when you're watching my theories and they don't quite line up with what you're used to hearing, that's because I have a different take on the situation. And like I've said in other videos about theories, everything can be right and everything can be wrong and things can contradict each other, but you can all still have fun with it. Alright, that's out of the way, so let's move on to the timeline. Now, I believe that somewhere in pre-American history, the beldam creates the other world, likely by capturing the fairy that is seen in the books. And that fairy would give her the power that she needed to create everything and probably survive off of that for a long time. In the 1850s, the Pink Palace was built. Also in the 1850s, I believe the Pioneer Girl was lost to the beldam, and she was likely the first child to ever live in the Pink Palace. In the 1880s, Huck Finn Jr. is taken into the other world and lost to the beldam. And that I base off the fact that Coraline calls the little boy Huck Finn Jr. in the movie, and in the book he refers to having a governess. And governess were used primarily before World War I, and of course the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn came out in about the 1880s, so there's a little bit of a spread there that's possible, but I'm gonna guess around the 1880s because of Miss Spink and Miss Forcible that I'll get to in 1 second. So in part 9 of my Coraline theory, I said that somewhere between 1915 and 1921, Miss Spink and Miss Forcible visit Maine and obtain a seeing stone. In 1921, Miss Spink and Miss Forcible move into the Pink Palace. They take a small basement apartment because their fame had been drying up as they aged, yet the ladies are convinced that they are still magnificent and they will bounce back to perform again to adoring crowds. And they are able to do this when the beldam lures them into the other world and they're able to see themselves performing on stage again to their adoring crowd of dogs. And because of that, they end up being trapped in the Limbo Pink Palace from then on. In 1936, Mr. Bobinski moves into the Pink Palace as he works on his new circus act. He takes the small attic apartment because 1, money is tight because the circus is going belly up in America, and 2, he plans to leave for the road anyways as soon as his next show is ready. The beldam is able to lure Mr. Bobinski into the other world and show him a functioning mouse circus, which enamors Bobinski so much that he also becomes trapped in the Limbo Pink Palace. Now, neither he or Miss Spink and Forcible ever question who or what the beldam is because they have never stopped being seduced by their own egos. They are all aware that something is wrong with how they're living, but since they keep getting to relive their glory days, they don't want to question it and become washed up nobodies again. And no, none of them sew buttons into their eyes, but because their egos are so large, the beldam has been able to feed off of their magic. You know, like believing in yourself is the strongest type of magic, so their ego would literally be something that the beldam could eat. So the beldam has been able to feed off of their magic for decades by keeping them trapped in the Limbo Pink Palace, which is sort of like a refrigerator for the beldam's long-term meals. In 1960, Mrs. Lovat moves in with her family into the Pink Palace. They get the big apartment because they are at least a family of 4. And then shortly after that, Mrs. Lovat loses her twin sister to the other world. Mrs. Lovat's father likely stayed there and eventually purchased the Pink Palace, hoping that his lost daughter would someday return. In the 1970s, Mrs. Lovat becomes Mrs. Lovat by getting married, and she and her husband do not stay in the Pink Palace even though her father owns it, because she is scared to death to raise any children there, so they move down the road. In the 1990s, Mrs. Lovat's father dies and leaves ownership of the Pink Palace to his only remaining daughter. Because Mrs. Lovat is already getting older and finding mobility harder, she asks her grown son to help her by being the maintenance man of the Pink Palace. Her son is ultimately lured into the other world, and since Miss Lovat has experience with this circumstance, she finds a way to plead with the beldam not to steal her son away and offers to do anything if the beldam will just let him come home. Her son is turned into the black cat, and this is done because the beldam really needs a true familiar that can be used as her anchor into the real world. So this action lets Mrs. Lovat's son return home, but it also means that Mrs. Lovat and the cat have to work for the beldam, and this also meant that Wybie got left in Mrs. Lovat's permanent care, which is why she is the authoritative figure in the movie and not the friendly old grandma with cookies and fun times and don't worry about anything. Now, all of the animosity that the beldam shows the cat is just for the sake of making Coraline believe that the cat is her ally. That brings us to the early 2000s, and the cat's job is to get children trapped in the other world. And he's done a really poor job of it so far because word has spread throughout the small town of Ashland that there's something mystical or haunted inside of the Pink Palace. As Wybie becomes more independent and keeps coming closer and closer to the Pink Palace, the cat fears for his son's safety and finds a way to convince Mrs. Lovat to allow a family with children to move into the Pink Palace. Then in either 2002, if you prefer to go off of the book, or 2009 if you prefer the movie, the Jones family moves into the Pink Palace, Coraline enters the other world, and ends up trapped in the Limbo Pink Palace along with Miss Spink, Miss Forcible, Mr. Bobinski, and the beldam, who is posing as the real Mrs. Jones. Since Coraline does not know any better, she loves the other mother, thinking it's her actual mother, and that love is the magical energy that the beldam feasts on. This trick explains how the beldam eats up your life, why the ghost children say that their deaths did not hurt, and why they commented that she stole their hearts. And if you are completely lost at this point, I'm going to beg you to go back with my Coraline Theory Part 1 and watch that through Part 9 so that it will hopefully all line up and make sense as to what the heck I'm talking about. Thanks for watching this video, and if you liked it, I hope you'll like, subscribe, and check out what other videos are on my channel. Please definitely subscribe though, so that way you'll be notified when I make new videos. And if you really want to help me out, please share this video with people that you think would enjoy watching it. Thanks again!